session 2 of the Policing the Pregnancy Conference. My name is Julia Carter. I am a lecturer in sociology here at Christchurch, and I'll be chairing this session. So this session is called Bad Bodies, Bad Choices, Behavioural Advice and the Pregnant Woman. And this is a slightly different session, I believe. Each panel is a roundtable. Each panel member will talk for 5 to 10 minutes. Then there will be a discussion, about 20 minutes to half an hour amongst the panel, and we will then open up for questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. This is Dr. Ellie Lee from the University of Kent. She is Director for the Centre for Parenting and Culture Studies, and she is a reader in social policy. And she is the author of Abortion, Motherhood and Mental Health, Medicalising Reproduction in the United States and Great Britain. Thank you, Ellie.
Thanks very much, Julia. So the way that we're doing this is that there's 3 of us, myself, Clare and Sarah, who are going to look at particular kind of examples, and then Pam has the formidable task of explaining the generality of the phenomenon. So, you know, that's what we're going to do. So the bit of it that I'm talking about is alcohol and pregnancy. Obviously, there's a range of different ways that you could talk about this, and aspects of the way things in our work that you could discuss and comment on. I thought some of the slides, even though Jenny's gone there, some of the slides that Jenny had earlier on, the whole imagery around the thing, is obviously really interesting and a great way of looking at this in a way of developing things. And I think there's a huge amount of mileage parts of people who are inclined to look at this topic more to take that question of the imagery of the pregnant body and the woman who drinks. What I wanted to do though was just focus very specifically on official advice. The main reason, well, there's 2 reasons for wanting to do this. One is obviously it's important. So what officialdom says to us about what we should do and what we shouldn't do is clearly a very important part of the way our lives work and the way we might think of things. And obviously that also, what officialdom has to say, filters down through services, and given that a lot of the people here in this room are people involved in service provision and at the cold face of interacting with pregnant women in their role as midwives, I'm particularly interested in seeing what you think about this area of things. And what you think about trying to discuss some of these things with women, and how you're experiencing the way in which the Department of Health and the Chief Medical Officers are posing issues at the moment. So that's one aspect of things I'm interested in. The other is that, as I'll go on to say, and as people will have picked up from the media coverage around this topic this morning, the advice changed in November last year, so the Chief Medical Officers put out new advice as part of a wider commentary on safe drinking, which basically, generally speaking, has the message to everybody, don't drink at all, so it's not just pregnant women. But at the time, the aspect of that advice about pregnancy didn't become a public debate. People will probably remember that instead what happened was that the wider message became the subject of debate. So when Dame Sally Davis, who's England's Chief Medical Officer, said when you have a glass of wine, think about breast cancer, there was quite a lot of reaction to it and big discussion about what a boring woman Dame but anyway, there's a whole, but there's part of this advice about pregnancy, so I wanted to talk about that really. So, here's the thing. This century, advice about drinking in pregnancy has changed remarkably. So before the 21st century, the Department of Health and officialdom did not issue or have specific advice on this. So this is a 21st century phenomenon, to note that first. And I think that raises one of the wider issues about what's giving rise to all of this. Anne raised this earlier on, I don't know if she's gone, but to what extent we see this as an outcome of medical science, genuinely knowing more, us just understanding more about pregnancy and the fetus, and therefore we have more advice. Or is the relation between what we know, what we think we know, and advice a bit more complicated than that. And I think broadly speaking, that's the kind of context for the discussion. The advice changed in 2007, so that's that one here. Well, the advice emerged in 2007, so that was the first time the Department of Health chose to specifically advocate abstinence to pregnant women, and that was its top line. And anybody who remembers that, who's old enough, who was following the discussions, there was a big debate about this at the time, 10 years ago. Because of this abstinence advocacy, but what they had was this second bit underneath. If you choose to drink to minimise risk to the baby, you should not drink more than 1 or 2 units of alcohol once or twice a week, and you shouldn't get drunk. So that was the official advice. What the chief medical officers did at the end of last year was basically remove the second bit, so that any reference to a choice to drink and what that might be was taken out of the advice. So the advice that we now have is the top one. If you're pregnant and think you could become pregnant, which obviously is like anybody, the safest approach is not to drink alcohol at all, to keep risks to your baby to a minimum. And then this idea that drinking in pregnancy, note an unspecified amount of drinking in pregnancy, can lead to long-term harm to the baby. The more you drink, the greater the risk. So that's the advice as we have it now. And overall, what I wanted to talk about is how we might characterise this interpretation of evidence. So what the relation is between evidence and the interpretation of evidence offered to us. Now, everybody interprets evidence, and everybody has the right, and in fact probably duty, to interpret evidence, me as much as anybody else. We have to make sense of it and find ways of giving meaning to it. And what's at issue for me is what we think about the particular interpretation of evidence being offered to us presently by officialdom. Now, in order to talk about this, because it is quite complicated, what I've tried to do in the way that can make sense for a short talk and with these slides is just give you some quotes which come from footnotes. So these next 2 slides are based around me going through the Chief Medical Officer's advice and the document, which is available to anybody, and looking at the footnotes. So looking at what they cite as their evidence for their advice, and that's where these things come from. Now, running through from 10 years ago, 2006, 2007, through to now, there is a consistent reference to evidence provided by Ron Gray and Jane Henderson and others. They're epidemiologists. They were looked to by the Department of Health back in 2005-2006 to conduct a systematic review of the evidence, present that to the Department of Health in 2006. That quote at the bottom comes from the evidence they presented to the Department of Health in 2006. So this was the evidence base for the first abstinence guideline. In summary, for most outcomes, there was no consistent evidence of adverse effects from low to moderate prenatal alcohol consumption. However, the evidence is probably not strong enough to rule out any risk, and I'm going to go on and talk about that kind of idea as well. There was some evidence of adverse effects on neurodevelopment of binge drinking during pregnancy. So that is what underpins the first don't drink message. So you can see a relation there. Have a think about what you think that relation might be. These other 2 articles were published subsequently in academic journals, reiterating no consistent effects, no consistent significant effects. Okay, so that evidence base from Ron Gray and Jane Henderson is retained through 2016. In 2016, the Chief Medical Officers also refer in their footnotes to what they call new evidence about this area of low to moderate drinking. And these are the 2 main papers that they refer to, so published subsequent to 2007, so more recent papers. Light to moderate alcohol consumption shows no effect. No strong evidence of fetal effects from low levels of alcohol exposure. Both of these papers, I should note, go on then to say no woman should drink in pregnancy. So that's an interesting issue about how academics present messages themselves, but that's what the papers say. This wasn't included, which I don't understand why. Maybe they don't know how to do literature reviews and use databases. But anyway, this was a big study. It was widely reported in the media. I don't know how anybody could have missed it. Published in 2013, considered a very credible, large-scale study published in the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. No consistent effects of low to moderate alcohol consumption or binge drinking in early pregnancy on offspring behaviour at age 5 years. Okay. The last footnote reference that I want to refer to, because I think it's quite interesting, is their rationale for removing the second line of the 2007 advice, so the choose to drink 1 to 2 units a week. This is what the CMOs say in their report. There is some evidence that the second part of the current English CMO guidance, so that's the 2007 guidance, may have been read by women as implying a recommendation to drink alcohol at low levels in pregnancy, which was not the intention. Now this is the cited evidence, but it's not published, and neither you, I, or anybody else will ever be able to read it unless the people who did this write it up somewhere. I can't even find out who they are, you can't find out anything about it. What I can assume is that it's some people who went and did a few interviews with some women, and maybe 1 or 2 of them said, this means I can drink 1 or 2 units once or twice a week, which would be a perfectly reasonable thing to think anyway. So, that's the CMO guidance, that's their footnotes, those are the things that are in relation to each other. So as I say, the thing for me that's interesting then is to turn to the question of interpretation. How do you interpret this evidence? The CMOs make it very clear in the text of their guidance that they are interpreting. So they don't just say this is what it says, they offer an interpretation. And this is what they say. Current evidence supports a precautionary approach, that's their term. The guidance should be clear that it is safest to avoid drinking in pregnancy. They argue this because they contend that evidence is not robust enough to be completely conclusive. And they emphasise the importance of clarity and simplicity in providing meaningful health messages to the public. So that's their interpretation of what they think their responsibility is as chief medical officers in relation to us, and the interpretation they give to us. Now, you know, this is a fair description of their interpretation. This is what they're doing, and this is what they're saying. The advice, don't drink at all, ever, if you could get pregnant, is very, very precautionary. That's uncontentious. And you could argue it is clear and simple. I mean, it's astoundingly clear and simple, remarkably clear and simple. My contention, which is what I want to discuss with you, is that I think it's other things too, by merit of these features, and these are the things I think it is. I think it's truth hiding and harm inflating, which I think is a dangerous thing for anybody to do if they're claiming to be providing people with an assessment of evidence and making claims to be thinking in a way that's in line with the imperatives of science. I think they are actually disregarding of the truth as it stands and what is possible to say if you are somebody who is truth-seeking and wants to present the truth. Because the fact of the matter is there will never be evidence that's more robust than this, and people should just stop trying to find out about it. Because you can't conduct a randomised controlled trial of pregnant women and test the effects of different levels of drinking on fetal development over the long term. Nobody's ever going to do that study, are they? It's just impossible. And what we now have is a lot of papers and a lot of evidence, and they all say the same thing. If you keep saying that that is not robust enough, then what are you really saying? What you're really saying is all we can say to you is that we can never know, and we don't want you to think properly and know what there is to know already. It's kind of a Rumsfeldian, remember, unknown unknowns about which we know nothing, which then launched the war against Iraq. It's that kind of thinking at play here, which I think is anti-scientific. I think it's manifestly paternalistic and quite explicitly restricts and delegitimises choice. based on the idea of presumed best interests of others, that the CMOs know what is in the best interests of others, and they are therefore going to rule out choice quite directly and quite explicitly, because they presume to know what's in the others' best interests. And what they think we need is things that are simple. Our best interests lie in having messages that are simple. Now, I don't think that's true. I don't think my best interests or your best interests lie in simplicity. I think as adults we deserve to be able to engage with complexity and think for ourselves. And then probably the two aspects that are most important for this discussion is that I think the way I would characterise this kind of emphasis on proportion is that it's both moralistic and it's autonomy reducing. It's moralistic because it's simply about telling women to follow a rule. It's not giving them information. It's not increasing their knowledge. It's simply giving them a rule, saying this is how you should live your life. And that is a moralistic thing to do, even if it's disguised as science. And I think it's autonomy reducing, which is, I think, a really, really important issue now, because what it does is invite others in society all the time, over and over again, to take a view on whether women are complying with this rule. And if you don't believe this, anybody can test it out. Just get a woman who you know, who's visibly pregnant, send her into a pub and get her to order a glass of wine and see what happens. My bet would be that will not go uncommented on, and it will not be thought of the same as some bloke going up to the bar and ordering a pint of beer. She will get a different response, and I would characterise that as autonomy reducing and also sexist, which has been my main comment to the press this morning. So, it's all very easy for me to say this as a sociologist working in a university. As I say, one of the things that I'm interested in the discussion is where does it leave any of you as midwives? Are you happy to say to the women that you see that they should disregard what the chief medical officers have to say, which of course is the logic of my argument? Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much, Ellie. So next on the agenda, we have Clare Murphy, who is the Director of External Affairs at the British Pregnancy Advisory Service. Speakers.
So I'm going to broaden these things out to think about the way in which obesity currently plays out in regard to women. I think all of us will recognise in terms of sort of obesity narratives more generally, obesity is obviously deemed a public health problem of our time, and there's been a sort of huge amount of analysis of the portrayal of the obese more generally as a kind of morass of ignorant, irresponsible individuals who are unable to self-regulate in urgent need of some kind of remedial intervention to stop their big bodies being a big burden on an increasingly impoverished NHS. And what I want to explore is the specific portrayal and treatment of the obese pregnant woman and how today she is being held responsible for the very transmission of obesity to generations to come through her own very body. The title of this conference is Who Should Be a Mother? And my contention is that the very way in which risk and outcome is communicated vis-a-vis obese pregnant women is very much geared towards the conclusion that an obese woman is not fit to be a mother and should be deterred from doing so. And I think it's a time when pregnancy is seen as an act that should be very carefully planned and prepared for in bodies that epitomise health and well-being. The obese, unregulated body is seen as an unsuitable location for gestation. And I want to talk about what the implications of this are and why we need to engage with this as an issue. Risk, as the sociologist Deborah Lupton has argued, is a concept with multiple meanings and is ideologically loaded. Risk discourse is often used to blame the victim, to displace the real reasons for ill health on the individual, and to express outrage at behaviour deemed socially unacceptable. And I want to think about the communication of risk too, but also about obese pregnant women in two respects, and in regard to this kind of philosophy. So the immediate risks that obesity poses in pregnancy, and the suggestion that obese women are placing future generations at risk of disease and ill health by the very environment of their wombs. The latest data shows that around 1 in 5 women are clinically obese with a BMI of 30 or more at their first antenatal appointment. And I think we need to be very clear that we shouldn't be in any doubt that obesity in pregnancy poses risks, and that these risks are real, and that women have a right to information about these risks on which to base their reproductive decisions and choices. But I think we need to engage with how these risks are communicated and ensure that science is communicated in a fair way, which doesn't distort the evidence. So I think if we have a look, for example, at the NHS Choices website on the risks of obesity and overweight. So it starts off by warning obese women that they're more likely to miscarry, but assuming that they are lucky enough for that pregnancy, assuming it's wanted to continue, warns them that they are 3 times greater risk of gestational diabetes, while the risk of preeclampsia doubles. But what I'd say is that I think it's very hard for anyone to draw real meaning from these without understanding what the risks are in the first place. So yes, women are at significantly increased risk of gestational diabetes, but between 85% and 90% of obese pregnant women will not develop gestational diabetes. Gestational diabetes is also, of course, linked to having a large baby. Indeed, as you see at the bottom, the website warns that having a BMI of over 30 doubles your risk of having a baby weighing more than 4 kilograms or 8 pounds 14 ounces, but it gives no context as to why this may or may not be a problem, simply by very virtue of its largeness. She's produced a sumo baby who's ready to be pictured and mocked. So the way in which a site like the NHS Choices website communicates this evidence actually really runs counter to NICE guidance, for example, on how risk should be communicated to patients. NICE really stresses the need to use absolute risk rather than relative risk, and to employ both negative and positive framing. And I think the question that we're really addressing is whether the way in which this information is presented, is it simply telling women how it is, with no kind of sugarcoating, or presenting information in such a way as to lead anyone to the obvious conclusion that an obese pregnancy is inherently risky and problematic. I think what's also really interesting is that while obese pregnant women have increasingly become the real focus of public health policy, there's been relatively little research that has explored their own experience of pregnancy and maternity care, and how they themselves interpret and internalise these messages regarding risk. A short survey we recently undertook of 100 women with a BMI of 30 or more who'd given birth in the last 5 years found that the majority had the risks of being obese in pregnancy discussed with them. Some women reported these risks were raised nearly 30 times. And women reported that on occasion the way in which these discussions were had made them feel distressed, frightened, and humiliated. Half said they felt judged by healthcare professionals in the process. These are some of the comments that have come out of our research. Second one is a woman who'd had severe pregnancy sickness, who'd had hyperemesis gravidarum, who was basically told, isn't it great you had HD during pregnancy, because look, you've actually managed to lose a little bit of weight. But I think what's also really pernicious is the way in which this conversation is also being conducted outside of the maternity wards, and that is really focused on the risk, not just that obese women pose to themselves in their pregnancy or the immediate health of their babies, but to the long-term health of their offspring. The last report into women's health by our Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, was sticking pins in her by the end of the day, I expect. But she declared that these women were not just harming the health of their own children, but were harming the health of generations to come, because, she said, the environment of their wombs was affecting the gametes, the eggs of the developing fetus. So that meant the offspring that her offspring would go on to have, were effectively being pre-programmed to develop disease. And this was communicated by her with such authority in a report which effectively described obesity as a kind of form of terrorism. But the evidence base for this is extremely shaky and hypothetical. We also had warnings from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists telling women that if they're obese while they are pregnant, their children are more likely to grow up to be obese. Now this is true, but it rather disguises the fact that we simply do not know how the environment of the womb shapes long-term outcomes. A very recent study actually concluded that there was very little evidence at all to support any long-term impact of a mother's BMI in pregnancy on a child's risk of fatness in childhood and adolescence. That any association is much more likely to be the product of genetics and shared lifestyle characteristics. And obese women, as I said, are not just being blamed just for obesity in their offspring, but a whole host of diseases in later life. And essentially it seems that the public health problem, regardless of that, of obesity, is very much being placed at the feet of pregnant women when we know its causes are complex and closely related, for example, to social deprivation, but that's almost kind of been shifted out of the picture. And things to say, I think even if you accept the basis of obesity in pregnancy is a serious problem, research shows that even with lots of lifestyle interventions in the lives of obese women once they are pregnant, there's very little evidence to show it improves any outcomes. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with increasing calls for intervention in women's lives before they are pregnant. The absolutely, so the absolutely abhorrent Tam Fry, I don't know if anyone's come across him, of the National Obesity Forum, describes the fact that half of women going into pregnancy are overweight or obese as a terrible indictment on our failure as a nation to prepare women for motherhood. The solution, according to him, is more weighing of children. It should be obligatory that local education authorities check the weight gain of all secondary school children, not just for their own health, but also for the generations of children whom they will bring into the world. The British Fertility Society wants to go into schools to teach 9-year-old girls how to get pregnancy ready. The key things that need to be part of this conversation are about the need for a healthy diet, a healthy body weight, doing enough exercise, and most importantly, not smoking. How to get women fit for pregnancy is now the focus of a project from Public Health England. It is about women having a healthy weight, eating well, not smoking, not drinking, not taking drugs, not being stressed out before they conceive. And I think it's really worth thinking for a moment about the very term fit for pregnancy and what its connotations are, because if you are not fit for pregnancy, you are unfit for pregnancy. And to ensure this doesn't happen, now the kind of thinking goes, is the idea that women should be regularly quizzed at GP appointments about their pregnancy intentions and using the most effective method of contraception until they are pregnancy fit, to avoid any kind of conception taking place in a body that isn't ready. So in conclusion, the point I'd really like to make is that reproductive choice is about the decision to have children as much as the decision not to. And the suggestion that all good, responsible pregnancies should be gestated in lean, alcohol-free, youthful, but not too youthful, because obviously we've got children in teenage pregnancy, bodies, which have been fitted with the most effective form of contraception until that moment arrives, I think is actually quite sinister. And it's cooked up by people who seem to have no understanding of how pregnancies happen. Conception for many people is messy, It can be drunken. It can be ambivalent. It can be planned, unplanned. And we may like the idea that all women wanting to avoid pregnancy would use a long-acting reversible method of contraception, such as an implant or a coil, but in reality many women don't for all sorts of very valid reasons. Unplanned pregnancy is a fact of life. Contraception fails, sometimes we fail to use it properly, and the most effective methods are not necessarily always the methods most suited to most women. As BPAS is an organisation which sees tens of thousands of women with unplanned pregnancy every year, we would never want to end up in a situation where abortion is seen as almost a responsible choice for a woman who has not carefully planned and prepared for her pregnancy. Obese women experience unplanned pregnancy too, or may try unsuccessfully to lose weight before embarking on a planned pregnancy, and I'd say they have a high chance of a healthy pregnancy and should be supported to achieve that, not judged or told they are sentencing the child within them to a lifetime of ill health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Two very interesting talks so far. So next up, we have Dr. Sarah Christie, who's from our very own Research Centre for Children, Families and Communities, where she is a Senior Research and Knowledge Exchange Fellow.
Hello, good morning everybody. I'm afraid that I want to say thank you to Ellie and Claire for taking me back 5 years or so when I was at my first antenatal product for my third child, and I was obese, I was still obese, and I had also had a few drinks before I became pregnant because I was not, it was unplanned and I was not pregnancy fit. And I remember now the shame when they wrote geriatric and obese at the top. My son's lovely. Okay, so I work here, and this is where I work. I work in the Research Centre for Children, Families and Communities, and we're a dedicated research centre here in this university, and we do research that aims to explore the potential for improving the life chances of children, their families and their communities, and my specialism is the social psychology of motherhood and of course pregnancy as well. When they wrote geriatric and, and if you want to have a look, I've done a Prezi rather than a PowerPoint, which some of you may be familiar with, and if you want to have a look at it, it's public, you can find it. You can apparently search, although I didn't have much luck, but if you go onto our website or if you go onto the Policing Pregnancy hashtag, you can click on the link that is on our homepage there and it will take you straight into Prezi, and you don't have to have an account to view it, so you can view it any time. I'll leave it up there. Okay. So when I had that experience with my last pregnancy, thank heavens I was not also a heroin addict, because in the hierarchy of things, let's face it, if you're going to be a bad pregnant mother-to-be, then being a heroin addict is probably up there in some people's opinions. I want to talk to you, I haven't got long, so I want to talk to you quite briefly about a research project I did with women who were pregnant and who were heroin addicts. And I want to kind of, because you've heard lots today and we'll probably continue to hear quite a lot today about people's rights to be pregnant and to be mothers, I want to kind of get over that straight away and to say that I never viewed these women as not having a right to be pregnant and to have children. They, as Jenny said earlier, they're citizens, and as citizens they deserve respect and choices just like any other citizens. But of course we know that many people would consider heroin addicted women to be bad women and bad mothers or bad pregnant women. And of course the point I came to in the research, the media, trial by media, they'd already been convicted, demonised, junkie mothers, and probably still are. In research, they were invisible, really, at the point, it's changing slightly, but at the point that I came to the research about 10 years ago, they really were quite invisible, so there was lots of research that was done on the effects on the children of using heroin in pregnancy or using methadone in pregnancy, which is the replacement prescribed medicine if you seek treatment. And there was lots of talk about the medical effects on women of using heroin, but nobody really talked about the women themselves, and certainly nobody asked the women what they thought. So they were kind of invisible in research, and they were marginalised in treatment, I would say, because they did not always have suitable treatment facilities in drug treatment centres, and they did not have necessarily appropriate treatment in antenatal care. So demonised, marginalised and invisible, it's not a good place to be, really, as your probably already quite complicated life suddenly is getting a bit more complicated because you have a baby and your pregnancy to consider and all the transitions that involves. And so I wanted to do something that would change that, and it was really important to me that the focus was on the women themselves, and not to say that of course the babies matter and we all want healthy babies and babies that grow up to be healthy individuals. But I don't see it as a dichotomy. I really saw it as a missed opportunity, because if we're missing a trick in treating pregnant heroin addicted women properly, then they possibly won't have their best future, which means of course that the baby probably won't have their best future either. It doesn't need to be either or in my mind. It can be, if you help the mothers, then you're also helping the babies too. And helping the mothers means respect and getting rid of any judgments or preconceptions. So just a very brief introduction to the women that I'm talking about. So nobody can really say definitively how many women in the UK, I'm talking about specifically now, are heroin addicted and go through pregnancy at any one time. It ranges from about 1 in 200 to about 1 in 50. And the reason that there's no clear definition is, of course, some women hide it. They don't present themselves to services if they are in that situation. And it can be maybe picked up when they have the baby, it might not be. And of course there's lots of other complications because people use lots of different drugs. And the official research that's been done here and in other countries sometimes conflates the different types of drugs, even to tobacco, for example. So, substance use in many American papers considers tobacco in the same way that it considers heroin. So it's very hard to get a definitive answer about how many use. But just to give you an idea, I worked in lots of cities in the north of England, Midlands and the north of England when I was doing the research, and I worked specifically in a NHS outpatients clinic in Stoke-on-Trent, which is a big city. I'm not sure how many people, a few 100,000 I would say at least. And we saw about 40 women over the course of a year come through the system, so that gives you an idea. But that probably wasn't everybody, because, as I say, some women don't present to treatment. Most women in drug treatment are heroin addicted, and almost all are of childbearing age. And if they do go into treatment, so going into treatment means that you might go to an NHS clinic or a private drug clinic, and that you would normally be prescribed methadone to replace your heroin. When that happens, quite a lot of women regain their fertility, but they aren't always aware, or don't expect it, or life's a bit complicated, they don't keep an eye on it, and so pregnancies can happen. And the other thing, of course, which resulted in the women I spoke to, was that they become pregnant and sought out treatment, and can be fast-tracked usually if they're pregnant. Okay, I was interested in this particularly because it was two big transitions, going from being a heroin addict to trying to recover, and going from being a non-mother to a mother. And I was really interested about how that affected the women, and also how other people in those women's lives enabled that transition, hindered that transition, what impact they had. Just a quick nod to theory. I know it's a bit dull, but I just wanted to say, for those of you who like this kind of thing, I've kind of looked at social identity theory, which is a kind of seminal work back from the 70s. It basically says that when we're constructing our own identities, we actually look around for social groups that we want to align ourselves to, and we start to adopt the beliefs and ways of thinking of those social groups. And it is groups because, of course, we don't only belong to one. And as we do that, we kind of reject other social groups and we move and distance ourselves from those. And then more recently, Best and colleagues took that theory and said, actually, this is really relevant to recovery from drug addiction because people are moving from a drug-involved lifestyle to a non-drug-involved lifestyle, and that's a really big change in social groups. And it's really important that we understand how that happens. Let's go through that. Because I haven't got long, I'm going to go straight into the words of the women because I really feel it's important to hear the voices of the women that I interviewed because this is what they had to say about their treatment. I interviewed women in lots of different centres across England, and the NICE guidelines for treatment of heroin addicted pregnant women are just guidelines, and they've been interpreted in lots of different ways. There was lots of different treatment models, some of which involved specialist staff in health or social care, people who by status might be specialists or just because of the knowledge they had could be considered to be specialists. So the women I interviewed during the courses of their pregnancies had lots of contact with lots of different people, and they had quite a lot to say about how they thought the interactions had gone and their experience of the interactions. So I want to read their words. They were mostly women living in Doncaster, Derby, Stoke, Manchester. I'm not going to embarrass myself and try the accents, but I have written it down as they said it, so it sounds slightly odd with my very home counties accent saying what these ladies said. So the first one is talking about her experience of treatment with a specialist midwife, a midwife who's been trained as a specialism in drug and alcohol. The specialist midwife is a lot better. She knows a lot more about drugs. She understands the lifestyle you come from. She's not I wouldn't say there was no difference, but if you're talking about like stuff, she's more experienced. She knows all about methadone, and it makes me easier to talk to her because I know she knows what I'm going through, and I know she understands. When I first met her, she told me about the impact of things like, I've got a baby, and she explained, what would happen to me and stuff like that, and what would happen to the baby. So that she's talking about a specialist midwife. The next one's talking about the treatment by non-specialist professionals and how she felt about that. In fact, it's two quotes here, two different people. Yeah, my midwife doesn't even know. I'll say I'll have about 1 bag, 2 bags a day, that's of heroin. And she'll say, what's that? And then I have to sit there for about 45 minutes trying to tell her how you take it and how much it is. And she's still oblivious to it now. And then someone else said, the health visit is really nice, but when I told her about that use the other week, she's like, oh no, it's like take the baby to your sister or something. I said, I'm trying to explain it's not like that. I used to use that much. I know how much to use and not get so out of my head that I wouldn't know what to do with the baby. I don't think she understands that. She said, oh, take her to your sister's. It's not like I'm going to think, oh, I'm going to use in a minute. I'll just pop her around to my sister's at 9 o'clock at night when she's in bed, like at 6:30. It's pathetic. She's all right, but they just don't understand. So some very clear differences in the way the women felt about that. And that was something that came through in many of the interviews. It wasn't just those few examples. But I want to also emphasise that these relationships that the women had with these specialist midwives were very nuanced, and it also depended on everyone else that was around them, their partners, their parents, the way they felt about themselves, their own competencies and their assets in terms of psychological qualities and so on. So the next one is talking about how the midwife, I think it's the midwife, had not been strict enough with her. When I first talked to the drug treatment clinic, it's the treatment clinic, I expected them to be, oh God, it's really dangerous, stop using that. I expected them to be, not help me a bit more because I know it's down to myself, but it was like another thing to them, and I think I know it's down to me, but it seemed like, well, if they're saying it's not a problem, then, which I know it is, but they've never made a big deal of it, whereas I was like, oh, don't worry about it, but it was like, yeah, they seem very laid back about it. And I said, so you'd like them to be a bit stricter? And she said, a bit more of a shock, yeah, do this or we'll take your script off you, do this, or God, I can see the consequences. They were saying the research and that babies don't withdraw as much as because in America they really penalise women, don't they, for it? But she was like trying to say the opposite. I expected them to come. Sometimes you miss the guidance. So it was really interesting to speak to my colleagues here about that quote in particular, because this person really wanted someone to tell her what to do and to give her a shock, as she called it, to help her to stop using. I think the conclusion that I came to really was that it's very personal, and that I don't think there are any broad rules. And I understand that some of you are midwives and health visitors, and I think I would really be interested to hear whether you think there's chance for conversations to occur where you can get to know your clients well enough to be able to give them the type of advice that they need, because clearly they do have different needs. And also, of course, if you're not a specialist, then your training that you get in this kind of, and do you ever come across it, I suppose? I'm just going to quickly show this diagram. I do love diagrams, so I think to miss it out. These were the conclusions that I came to about why the specialist care matters. This was why it was so important for these women to have someone involved in their treatment who really had some specialist knowledge. And it wasn't just about being able to tell them about the impact of the drugs, but it was about being able to, if I refer back to that theory that I talked about, it was about enabling them to distance themselves from their drug-using lifestyle. So that's the arrows that go across to the left. Sorry, they're negative ones. If they're not specialised, then the women had to talk about their past, they had to talk about their drug use, they had to talk about how they'd lost their children. I found that very difficult, and it dragged them back into their drug-using lifestyle. And also being judgmental was very difficult for them too. But the specialist midwives, they're the dark grey ones, going over to the right. All those things that they did were so important, and not necessarily things that you would imagine straight away. You know, it was about being able to be honest with someone and to not be judged. It was about somebody who they could see as a confidant. It was about someone who understood about their lifestyle. They didn't have to go through it all the time. And that was a really important thing for them to kind of assimilate themselves into this new social identity of being a mother and a non-drug user. Okay, you've always got, whenever you do research, I always ask myself, and so what? Because otherwise, what's the point in doing it? You've got to come to some conclusions that are going to hopefully make a difference to people's lives. So there is a need for raised awareness of the complexity of some women's lives when they're pregnant and parenting. And yes, I've grouped heroin-addicted pregnant women and gave them that label. It's not a very nice thing to do. It's just circumstances. It's their circumstances that maybe gave them that label. But everyone's lives are complicated, aren't they? These women's lives are perhaps just a bit more complicated than other women's. Tailored services are really important because it, as that diagram previously showed, it's that support that facilitates the women's identity transitions. And if we can get that right, then hopefully that can lead to positive changes for these women, which is good for women, the baby, and society. If you want to look at it like that, it costs society a lot less if you have people off drugs and having family lives that are less complicated. And specialist knowledge is really important. And I want to make a case for these professionals who do an amazing job of really supporting these women. Some of the fantastic people I've met over the course of my research. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And finally, with the task of drawing these papers together, Dr. Pam Lowe, Senior Lecturer in Sociology and Policy at Aston University, and published a book last year called Reproductive Health and Maternal Sacrifice.
Right, so I've been sort of changing what I was saying as people are talking, so it might come out completely at random, so just bear with me, I think I'll put it together. Right, so what I'm interested in particular is about both continuity and change in ideas about motherhood. And for me, the idea of sacrifice is what holds this together. So women are expected to make sacrifices, and that is a constant throughout history. Now, what those sacrifices are might change. Now it might be, being thin and, sort of not drinking alcohol. But the fact that women were supposed to make sacrifices has been there for a long time. So the symbolic, embodied and practical requirements of suffering or selflessness of mothers is what I'm talking about in terms of maternal sacrifice. is to say it's not a new idea. And if we think of the term sacrifice itself, sacrifice is always seen as a good thing. It's a virtue, yeah? But it's a virtue that also holds the social order together. So in the original meaning, or one of the original meanings of sacrifice is where, you know, they kind of go and kill a goat or something. It was a ritual that held the community together, all right? So, like, a sacrifice is also about the moral order of society. And those who are suffering have a high moral position, right? So, for example, the anti-abortionists, they love a woman who says publicly that she won't have cancer treatment for the sake of her developing fetus, yeah? And that's seen as the ultimate sacrifice to give your the life to your child. So what that means is that, you know, but these ideas is the fact that women are always supposed to do put the needs of their developing fetus or their child first. And that is what makes it, like, that's the natural form of womanhood, right? That's the position that women are supposed to be in. And because of the links between motherhood and, like, women being women, so if you don't make sacrifices, you're not just failing as a potential mother, but you're potentially failing as a woman herself. So these are the ideas that kind of things, because we have gendered bodies. Now, I'm not going to go into like loads of historical things about how that arises, but these ideas are really important because they're currently played out through this discourse of risk, right? So the ideas of risk and responsibility is what, and those are the sacrifices we're supposed to make. You know, why take the risk, okay? And we can tell that the positioning of women, so this is, I'm sure you've all seen this is Jim Lane, it's by Hogarth, and so the drunk mother kind of doesn't even know that she's let go of the baby, and it's the archetype of a bad mother. She's not making the appropriate sacrifices for her child. So the gendered understanding of women who should naturally put their needs first, and the welfare of any existing or potential children first, comes into what Sally was saying earlier about the idea of deserving and undeserving abortions. Yeah? So the good mother, you know, sort of like, is that kind of, you know, middle class, married, whatever was on the slide, I can't remember the exact word, Sally. But yeah, and so she should not be deserving of abortion because she should make the sacrifice to have her child whether or not she wanted to be a mother at that particular time. And the undeserving cases for abortion, and the deserving cases of the women like that, or potentially the heroin-using mothers, who should actually, even if they want to be mothers, they're not fit to be mothers, so they should actually make the sacrifice not to become mothers, and therefore potentially choose to have an abortion. So, and these ideas are particularly linked today with this idea of the vulnerable fetus. Alright, so the fetus is everywhere, they're used to advertise cars and they pop up in all places, they're always disembodied, yeah? You know, the free-floating fetus, sometimes with an umbilical cord, nothing to do with women whatsoever, obviously. But even in the way that we think about it, I mean, I love the phrase maternal-fetal conflict. Have you heard about this, particularly midwives? They talk about it all the time. It's not a conflict between the mother and the fetus, it's a conflict between the mother and the health professionals telling her what to do, right? That's the conflict. But the way that we frame it is around the conflict between like a mother and a fetus. So mothers are now potentially a risk, right? So we are the ones that are potentially going to fail the nation. Because it's also a threat, as I was saying earlier, to this idea of the moral order. If you go back to the ideas of Yuval Davis, so mothers literally give birth to the nation, right? And Jan mentioned community and the idea of kind of community going on earlier. So through women being able to generate a new generation, and this comes back to the idea of why you need to control reproductive health to me. Because the whole future of your group, your community, your nation comes down to controlling pregnant women during their reproductive health. So the generational risk of obesity is one of those things which is a threat to the moral order. Yeah, the idea, the potential for children to have fetal alcohol syndrome, again, is a threat to the moral order, so somehow future generations will not be fit to be a nation. So in some ideas that, you know, we've replaced the idea of the monstrous birth that came up during history. So some of you will know about the idea of maternal impression, which was very, very kind of prevalent in the Middle Ages, the 16th, 17th century. The idea of women looked at something horrific or had bad thoughts, that will somehow impact on the developing fetus. But we've now moved to this idea of the antisocial family. Yeah? So this is what Jenny was saying earlier in her talk about, you know, the idea of parenting. So women are now responsible for avoiding, you know, future generation risk, and it's done through this idea of the antisocial families. So all of those things that, you know, are potentially risk to the nation in terms of what we do, and it feeds into this idea of, you know, the cycle of troubled families, you know, the workless families, yeah? And those are the people that we need to potentially prevent from having future children. So the generational risk of obesity, the sumo babies, the heroin users, all of those things have got the potential feel of an antisocial family about them in today's kind of way we phrase things. And so we have to protect the vulnerable fetus from the mother's body. So, how did we get here? Well, I think potentially it is about the idea that we think about choice, okay? Now, within the neoliberalist project, and I'm not espousing here a very kind of economic view of neoliberalism, but just some of the ideas in the contemporary period. So the idea that we're all responsible as individuals, it's very much the public health message. So the project of the body, yeah? It doesn't matter that, you know, you are on a 0-hour contract, you are the one responsible for your own health, yeah? And we're all supposed to, you know, eat our 5 or is it 10 fruit and veg a day, and we're all supposed to do our 10,000 steps, and we're all supposed to do that. So it's a very individualised body product way. And we're supposed to make responsible choices. And that's the thing. So rather than doing anything about deprivation, or, you know, it's up to the individual to be responsible for their own things. Now we can also see this idea of individualisation and responsibility in some of the policy changes. One of my big bugbears is the two-child policy in terms of tax credits, child tax credits that's coming through. What does this mean? Well, you know, if you choose to have more than 2 children, you can have potentially a life in poverty, right? And it doesn't matter that you might have had 3 children when you could afford it and then fallen on hard times, because you should have planned better, yeah? So the idea is that you're responsible and individual for, you know, future changes that might happen, and you should govern your body. And it's through disciplinary techniques that we govern it. So women are expected to optimise their health before getting pregnant by adopting health behaviours expected whilst pregnant. So as you know, Ellie and Clare have pointed out, you know, that this means that basically puberty to menopause, if you're heterosexually active, just pretend you're pregnant the whole time, right? But there's also this kind of really weird conflation going on between the preconception period, pregnancy, and the postnatal period, right? And the fact that, you know, birth isn't necessarily seen as very significant now as a marker of moving a responsibility from, you know, a woman to more generally the community. So you get the kind of like messages which are the same for all of those things. And they just, you know, they all kind of constitute a way of governing women in particular around what they want to do. And so we have disparate risk, right? So if outcomes are seen as women's poor decisions rather than linked to social determinants, but it's really important to think about that has a different impact, right? And it has a different impact because it depends on who you are and how you're already positioned in society. So if you're a nice white middle class woman living in a big house with a secure income and all these sorts of things, yes, you can afford to go down the pub and have a couple of glasses of wine and tell the bar person where to go if they tell you what to do. However, if you're not in that position, if you're already positioned as a bad mother potentially, maybe you're a heroin user, trying desperately to bring examples in from earlier. So compliance with those rules can actually position you as a good mother when your circumstances means that you wouldn't be otherwise, right? So it's only those people who have no indication that their children could ever be removed by social services that can necessarily afford to act on their own judgment rather than the advice. Okay, so your ability to reject this stuff, whether it is down to your social positioning. And it is a disciplinary technique. So, in terms of, and people internalise these rules, and they internalise these rules because they want to be seen as good people. They want to be good mothers. They want to be, good citizens. They want to be good women. So people internalise the rules, and they're sort of kind of stroppy social scientists, and then we just don't. Right, so what it kind of boils down to for me is about how all these things fit together. So it's about the idea of reasonable choices, right? What is reasonable? And so the campaign group for not drinking during pregnancy just kind of goes, well, it's just 9 months. If you can't, forego alcohol for just 9 months, then obviously, there's something wrong with you. But it has a much broader impact on that. Jenny mentioned earlier that she thought that, it was about, there was a difference that the women had gained in the private sphere, gained in the public sphere, but not the private sphere. I would disagree with this, actually, the kind of conceptualisation of this. For me, actually what we're seeing here is a backlash against women's gains in the public sphere. Because as women have gained a position in the workplace, as they have gained positions in power, what's happened is we've had more and more kind of discourses around reproductive health that firmly position women back in the maternal. Right? So if you think about the emphasis on breastfeeding, yes, there are some small health benefits for breastfeeding in the UK where we have nice clean water and safe formula, right? But what does the emphasis on breastfeeding does? It means that women are the ones positioned as the natural carers. It repositions women in the home, which is which has a disproportionate effect on their lives and careers in comparison to the potential health benefits of for the child. So these ideas of maternal sacrifice that good women would put the lives of children or potential children first, regardless of all other, it justifies the surveillance on women, and it also minimises the impact of poverty. Okay? So, the fact that you might be obese, it's all about your health choices and nothing to do with what's available in the local food bank. And rejecting reasonable sacrifices potentially positions women as bad mothers, but compliance with the rules positions women as potentially good mothers, and that can be important for women who are at risk of being seen as bad mothers in the focus. The idea of being fit for pregnancy, of course, it's about the fitness and unfitness, the deserving case for abortion, the undeserving case for abortion, again linked to whether or not women are positioned in society as matching up to this idea of making the sacrifice necessary. So the focus for me on fetal outcomes decenters women from pregnancy, as we've heard many people today, but it also is really important that it reinforces traditional discriminatory ideas about gender, which are quite frankly wrong.